Okay. That's unmuted. Can she speak? Which doctor? Nobody.
Which one is that?
I have no one.
Doctor?
Yeah, he's on mute. Yeah.
Okay, I can
Can
just
you
unmute you.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I just ask him to unmute. Ask him to unmute. Unmute. He was unmuted.
All right. Firstly, thank you for organizing this event. This goes to the organizers and the host, and to the rest of the panelists. Thank you for helping to make this event a great one. So I understand that we are to talk about rail in this panel. So for my case, I'm looking at primarily the JBHSR, which is the Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway. This project, currently, if you had gone to Indonesia now, it's very near to completion. The last time the president visited it was, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, right? Before he went over to China, Japan, and Korea. So I think there is a trend, and this trend is irreversible, that this trend is going towards what is called the ESG. I will not belabor it, but if we are to contextualize it in relation to what's happening in Indonesia, I think there's a few points that are worthy of mentioning, and I think some of these points overlap with what has been discussed earlier on this morning, as well as what is going to be discussed by my colleagues later on, right? So if you look at the Indonesian one, right, if you just look at the environment component, right, you realize that there are certain points that can be improved upon, right? And these include things like drainage, flooding, so on and so forth. Because if you look at just most of the projects that you see in most of the developing economies, you realize that people don't dispose of their trash very well. And because of that, drainage issues tend to occur time and time again. So there is that. And there's also, removing trees, deforestation, so on and so forth, right? And I would wager that this is not unique to Chinese infrastructure in Indonesia. It probably happens in many other places, right? So it's not a great thing, but I think we have to be aware of the context, right? And the other thing is on the social economic side, right? So I think if you keep track of Indonesian news, you realize that some of the people mentioned in the report, some of them have some legal issues to deal with. I will not go into detail, but you could find them on the internet, right? So one of the things that keeps getting pop up was, it relates to certain parties wanting certain development that may not be directly related to this project, right? And this is what you call a socio-economic side, right? And it's not that great. And I also tend to see it more contextually, that this thing is not uniquely Indonesian. I think it happens probably in a lot of places, right? Hence, you have projects that tend to go overboard, tend to take a longer to construct. So this is one of the things that I'm hoping that my colleagues can share as well. The last thing is on governance. I think if you rewind back the clock, if you rewind it back to maybe 6 or 7 years ago, at the time, this project was in the midst of a battle between a Japanese consortium as well as the Chinese consortium. We all know that the Chinese consortium eventually they won this deal, but the Japanese were very, very active. And at the time, the prime minister was the late Shinzo Abe. So he and his colleagues were actively pushing it. And I think you would also remember a gentleman by the name of Suga, right? Suga also became prime minister. You know, I think if you remember, about 1.5 years ago, he was the Japanese prime minister. At that time, he was chief sec. So he was one of the guys pushing the deal. But eventually the Chinese won out. How they won out, it's not very clear, but there was a lot of biddings and counter biddings, right? And then it got very, very confusing. And there is one point that some commentators are fairly upset about, because the original plan was sponsored almost entirely by the Japanese JICA. And what has transpired is that it is believed that the plan was handed over to the other side, and the other side basically just based on this blueprint, and they produce a proposal. So that made some people quite unhappy. But the reality is that the Chinese bid also included certain clauses that Tokyo was not willing to give, right? One of which is the waiving off of a sovereign guarantee, because these projects cost money, and usually they would require a sovereign guarantee. The Japanese requested that. The Chinese consortium didn't require that, right? So that was a plus for the Indonesians, because they have a way of managing their public debt. So what the Chinese got well was to target those points. So that was very important. And the other thing that the Chinese promised, but eventually didn't really work out, was that they promised that they could complete the project in a period that is a lot less than expected. And the Japanese, they were not able to commit to that. But of course, the project didn't get completed on time. So those were the two key points that perhaps made people question the governance aspect. With that, I will stop here, and I hope to have more discussions with the audience. And I believe that my colleagues can, add on to this angle. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it would be very interesting for us to then go to Dr. Otele for a Kenyan perspective on a very similar kind of set of controversies. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me from where your positions?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, Laura, kindly share my slides if you. Thank you very much. And let me appreciate the organizers and Chinese Embassy for organizing this useful seminar. As you have heard from Cobus, my name, I'm Dr. Otele Oscar. I'm at the Department of Political Science, University of Nairobi, and sorry for my internet fluctuation. I'm somewhere deep in the rural Kenya, but I'm happy to meet presenters from different parts of the world. Allow me to make appreciation of a Chinese involvement in railway sector, and this particularly on a controversial, I'll use that word, a project that have attracted lots of interest from several observers, and this is Kenya's standard gauge railway. A familiar story, as you may be aware, that the initial design of the project was actually to link East African coastal port of Mombasa to neighboring countries, particularly Uganda, Kampala, and Rwanda and South Sudan. But again, things were reviewed, and therefore the project in a way has more so remained within Kenyan confine, being implemented in various phases. Phase 1, which was completed successfully from Nairobi to Mombasa, completed ahead of 2017 election. Phase 2 also got underway to Naivasha, and that was finalized in 2019. And again, using similar parameter where the main financier here was China Exim Bank, contributing 85% of the total loan. Government of Kenya provided 15%, just like other projects, Chinese projects in Kenya. I want to believe even in some other parts of Africa and East Asia, I want to believe so. Where we've had challenges is third phase, where we've not seen lots of progress, because that was the phase that was now to link to the bordering countries, of which the initial agreement was that implementation on that part of the project phase will be pegged on potential financial promise on phase 1 and phase 2. So there's nothing that has happened under the third phase. Help me to move to the next slide so that we move together. So in light of our discussion, seminar discussion, basically the implementation of environmental, socioeconomic, and governance framework, I want to believe the context has already been set. And mine is now to basically focus on the implementation as in relation to SGR. Suffice is to say that environmental issues, as you may be aware, have elicited lots of reaction. And the reason why environmental issue attracted lots of reaction was that the project was passing through Nairobi National Park, the iconic park that is that's situated just right in the center, CBD. And of course, environmentalists and of course locals reacted because of the attachment, economic and some cultural attachment we place on the park. And the argument, as I have said, the SGR passes through that, and there was argument that the railway line will interfere with the migration movement, and of course overall expected economic return from tourists. So what did the main implementer that has undertaken this is China Road and Bridge Corporation, which again, I will say it was flexible in terms of adjusting, taking a more animal-friendly design, which essentially entailed raising parts of the railway to allow animals to pass underneath and add more points along the railway line. We also saw CRBC make innovative approach in terms of ensuring that they don't really interfere with the migration patterns of the those wildlife, the wildlife that survives in the park. Now, on matters socio-economic issues, we appreciate the fact that before the implementation began, China Exim Bank done a comprehensive environmental and social impact assessment, and this is in accordance with the ITIS 207 internal regulation. So what we are seeing here is an attempt by CBRC to follow laid down protocols before the implementation began. More importantly, is also the role of Chinese local actors, particularly the role of Chinese embassy, which monitored closely the status of compliance, and there were monthly reports that were made available on the website just to let the public be informed about how the implementation is progressing. We also note that in response to the fact that CRBC was keen to see to it that the local community is engaged in the implementation of the project, there were a number of issues that were raised by the local community, particularly issues to do with social amenities. For example, distractions in access to water, which CRBC made sure that they dug some boreholes there. They also constructed roads to enhance not only movement, but the integration of the local community within the implementation of the railway projects. The issue that also raised controversy was on the compensation, land compensation. And this became an issue because of the, inflated costs that emanated from speculation, elite manipulation, clientelism. So to the extent that when these issues were brought to the fore, in a way, it soiled the reputation of the contractor. But now, you see, the contractor's hands were a bit tied because now these were local issues that needed strong institution, particularly Kenya's National Land Commission, to come in and address such issues. So that was failure on the part of the local institution. To highlight on governance, the governance, of course, from the inception, we appreciate the award of the project to CRBC in exchange for free feasibility study. But I also need to say that from a competitive angle, CRBC in a way outdid an Italian company that had initially been given to start, doing a feasibility study on the same. And of course, when it came in, we note that there was a clear violation of the Kenyan constitution and the procurement laws, which were not followed, because there was no competitive bidding, even though at some point there was the argument about government-to-government provisions, which again, it was annulled by a high court just after the completion of phase 1 of the project. Interesting. Now, we also appreciate, in my presentation, I also appreciate the role played by President Uhuru Kenyatta, having a very strong interest in the implementation of the project. He personally took charge, what some colleagues have called a political championship, seeing to it that that the implementation actually is completed just a few months to election, where he actually used that, as to showcase that his first 5 terms in the office were, worthy something. There was something to show that he had implemented. The question of financial sustainability also came to the fore. Of course, Exim Bank, as I have mentioned earlier, insisted that the Treasury provides 15% of the project, and it was keen to see that that the project will be able to generate adequate revenue stream to ensure that repayment is achieved. So how did that agreement go about? We say that Exim Bank insisted on agreement between Kenya Port Authority and the government to ensure a crackdown on tracking, to ensure that there is adequate cargo so as to guarantee profitability, that will see to it that implementation, repayment is done without a delay. In that negotiation, again, there were pushbacks that arose from importers, and again, to add something on importers, these are people again who are deeply involved in Kenyan politics. In a way, started pushing back and forth in terms of demanding that they also get some concession on how they can obtain some cargo to ensure that they remain afloat. Now, when COVID happened, at 2019, 2020, now the reality again came in. Transport restrictions, social distance, and there was a ban on use of the SGR. Challenges of raising revenue to cover SGR expenses, became a true reality. So much that by mid-20, the SGR had accumulated operating losses estimated to close to 200 million USD. Now, even rendering it not in a position to pay the operator, Afristar, a whopping 28.8 million USD as operation fee. And therefore, as we recover gradually from the shocks of COVID-19, again, there have been reports that revenue streams are improving, and we hope that will be sustained so that government is in a position to meet its financial obligation when called upon. I want to believe my colleague who has made a presentation earlier on Indonesia, there are some similarities, there are some differences that we can put into perspective so that we can then also appreciate the comparative dimension of railway implementation in those two contexts. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otele. It's so interesting to see both of these projects side by side. We're moving towards Dr. Liu Haifang, and like her work has been so crucial in the China-Africa field. It's fantastic to be able to feature insights from her. Thanks so much. Go ahead, Dr. Liu.
Thank you, Cobus. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for both the sponsors to having me for such an important event. I have learned so much from previous colleagues, and then also Dr. Lee and from the embassy. All are very relevant arguments. I think I have learned also from Professor Chris Alden. Specifically, he highlighted so far China's engagement with Africa for infrastructure still full of spirit of learning by doing. With that, I reflect a lot of many different kind of cases. And today, I don't know whether the next session our colleague will talk about the cases like Start Time, which they really have a rather unique and then I would say very innovative financial way, and probably different from any other cases I look forward. But today, since I got the mission to talk about real, so I will still talk about my long-term engagement as well to do this Tazara studies. And then I would rather try to reflect not only the importance, the relevance of the railway today, but also talking about the spirit where in, I think, both African languages and the Chinese languages, we have sort of agreed upon many different kind of elements about so-called Tazara real spirit. And then such as solidarity, egalitarianism, sacrifice, so on and so forth. And then we also, in my presentation, I will read very importantly about how we think of railway's significance for not only Africa, but probably other developing country as well. So I will come to this point definitely in due course. And then also I will try best to using maximize my time to also talk about with Tazara, because we know when we are going back to the original point of this infrastructure engagement way back to 1960s, now Tazara is still ongoing with lots of problems, definitely. But then how to go on forward? This is still a relevant issue today. And of course, I will also go beyond this Tazara issue while trying to look at the meaning for Tazara in terms of a global development. So far, Tazara has caused lots of different kind of voices, not only the acknowledgement of that period of time, how three countries work together to have it established, but also the challenges. This is exactly one of the invitations I got from my Britain colleague who really invite me and my colleagues who have done research with me, Professor Jamin Monson, together to write the paper about how today we look at Tazara, because in their questions, in their invitation, they put it in another way. They ask if there ever a kind of a Tazara spirit. Maybe nowadays it's difficult to say the permanence of a Tazara spirit, because so-called solidarity has been either combined or replaced by commercial motivations. And of course, there are also lots of other ongoing situations making all these challenges, such as we know last year, Kawangda has also left the world, and then as that first generation of leadership of African just heard their independence, how they are remembered is still crucial issues. And people have been discussing a lot about what these leaders have been doing, and then what kind of either dictatorship or they have an authoritative way of ruling. Either way, people tend to neglect how these leaders, the symbolic meanings for me. For instance, these two leaders who brought the Hazara, established really in their own languages, still a symbol of independence, self-sustained value, and also sovereignty, which is really their key values when they are talking about. So when we're talking about how China joined these two countries for Hazara buildings, we definitely would go back to Bandung, and then immediately there were kind of a solidarity between China and many African countries. So far it started. And for me, the meaning really also in alignment with what Adam Smith in his famous book back to 18th century, he already tried to inquire. He asked the question if there was a world full of injustice, and how there was an outcome, how there might be an end for this injustice. And then he definitely championed in future how those inhabitants of all those different places, people can be respected, and then in that way injustice can disappear finally. So back to the origin of Hazara Railway, I would rather emphasize the two kind of reasons brought it to establishment. First, I want to emphasize, of course, as everyone emphasizes, Kaunda in his language, he also says there was such a dire need for an alternative route. So this is definitely of physical reasons, but there are also kind of a spiritual reasons which tend to be neglected in our current writings. As also many the older people, that generation reflected. Actually, back then there was a spreading myth that the white settler, their ruling will continue, and then the African independence is not guaranteed at all. So for those two countries, they also have those kind of a fear, and among people there was a very strong this kind of a myth that it's hard for them to stick with their independence, even they already had. So in this way, I would rather say spiritual, or you can call political. This kind of a reason was as strong as the physical reasons for the two countries are determined to really have this railway established. And then for China's role, as Kaunda said, it's our mission to be independent, and then China just help us to be ourselves. But of course, as I said, the Hazara was so much challenged due to its rather bad performance lately. And then here we can see the cargo, and then the volume doesn't show a very good picture. But this kind of voices way back to the time it was constructed, and then we all have heard so much about how World Bank, UN, they all had carried the feasibility studies with denied answers, and then later on, lots of scholars still using white elephants to metaphor Hazara in terms of its not a very much economic, the performance was not as good. But if we look at it from the other point of view, especially what I emphasize, the sense trying to keep their independence and then sovereignty, maybe we'll say very different kind of a value for this Hazara. railway back then. And then for me, there are also other ways to reprisal how Tazara has a long-term impact. And then I call it Freedom Railway as well as a People's Railway. Of course, this word I borrowed from my dear colleague, Jamie Monson, and then specifically in her book, she actually have covered lots of this kind of a long-term impact, such as how the satellite can cover how within 25 years time the people movement and then the growing economic activities. And of course, the current, these are done by our current interviews, and along the railway, people also reflect how the new towns emerged and then also how people have a new livelihood thanks to the railway. And then so the importance is really goes to those local people. Here, I want to raise a very important point of view about the meaning of the railway. As Jamie said, once the railway was completed, it became as important community, as important to the local community, as well as to Zambia, which has the mission to export their copper. So for her, the railway came to depend on the agency and the initiative, the rural user of the train, even more importantly. So here we can raise the point about not only it's supposed to help with Zambia for its exportation, but also the passenger belt, how for those years, several decades, they contributed to the railways continuous performance. And in terms of what really does it mean by People's Railway currently, we actually have seen, even during 2020, the financial year, we still have seen 2.8 million passengers. And this is already a little bit shrunk from previous years, 3.1 billion due to the COVID. And then so for me, this is still very impressive. Within 15 years time, triple the passengers if we compared with the 1990s and then 2000s. And all this really shows the meaning for the local development of the railway. Of course, there are also other dimensions that we called there, such as Nirari said, the first generation of industry workers, and then also the work ethic, how they have been transferred. And there are, of course, also benefit for both sides. For Chinese side, we actually also interviewed lots of very interesting people who are telling us, such as Angola also came to understand the quality of the railway, and then also the Tazara help to dispel the myths about Tazara being a bamboo railway, and then they show how it resists the flood, resists other natural challenges. And then so in that way, Chinese scholar have such a comment he was saying in this book. It's not a coincidence that the very first batch of Chinese construction companies gaining their worldwide acknowledged fame and the large market share in Africa more or less had their direct or the indirect footprint working for Tazara construction. Yeah, these are all just our reflections. And if we check today's Tazara situation, we have to go started from the reform of China's aid since 1980s. And we all are familiar with this fact. I don't want to repeat them. And then, but what I want to emphasize are Tazara hasn't been just between China and the two African countries. It's also a story has some Western interference. It just during the SAP programs, World Bank and then other donors, 10 of them all together, stepped in with firstly big money to stimulate its efficiency. And then in 1990s, also a reform program started. And then immediately lots of stations are closed. Were closed in 1994. So currently where Tazara goes, we have a record, interestingly, since, I apologize. For Chinese side, since 2000, we have seen several feasibility studies about how to rehabilitate the railway. There are several companies involved, but they all come with a rather denied answer about any single Chinese company couldn't do it. And of course, how to make it profitable is a big question mark. And then back then, Chinese government still continue to provide interest-free loans to the shareholding government. And then this Tazara's basic infrastructure, rolling stocks for those maintenance still paid by the Chinese interest-free loan. And then for the Tazara people who really committed their lives to make it happen, we also interview those people, how they look at Tazara. Actually, such as the deputy chief engineer, he actually discussed about Tazara has gracefully accomplished its mission, and now times the three sides need to discuss jointly about a way forward instead of only relying on this kind of Chinese aid to go forward. But different people, different stakeholders among the three countries also have very different view about how to do it, such as Tazara, Tanzania government, they really put a lot of hope for the gaining revenue from the mobility of populations. And then we also heard from many Chinese scholars about still relying on more mineral digging and transporting out of Zambia. And then also there are Chinese scholars and officials, different think tank. They also they criticized this kind of seemingly endless aid of the railway. And then there need to be a rather innovative way to reform it, according to many of the scholars. And then on the ground, we have seen the Tazara constitution has been reformed in 2015. They actually make it open to the private sector to invest in the railway. And according to Tazara, their estimations, the money needed for the rehabilitation is huge, so 1.2 billion US dollar. And we have seen the latest round of tri-party ministerial meetings in 2016. And of course, each side still promise how they would really commit to themselves to really revive the railway. And then former Zambia and president even say, if we don't do that, it's a betrayal for our forefathers. So to show the determinations. Lately, just in this month, we also have seen Tanzania, Zambia president visited Tanzania, and the two sides also agreed how to upgrade. And then currently CCECC, which was also the predecessor for the construction of this railway, now is doing their new round of feasibility study for rehabilitation, and we look forward positive outcome will coming out soon. In terms of Tazara, the spirit, I would just, I hope I still have 1 or 2 minutes for me just to finish my main idea. I think according to our really very rich interviews to both African side and then Chinese side, we have gathered good understandings about how people still think this spirit is still very relevant. For instance, someone says, even Tazara was under concessional operation, this railway, the egalitarian between China and the African side will be the same. And then also a specialist on China's aid, Professor Zhou Hong, emphasized what important for the any aid, because you cannot expect anything physical things can resist time. Time does consume everything, but what can be left is really the experience and then the knowledge sharings. She rather emphasized whatever the aid is, the left things should be experience, should be the knowledge sharing. And then so for that, and we also agreed that the Tazara spirit as a kind of intersubjectivity identity is still ongoing between the two sides. And then it's not only about how everyone from either the three countries, but also beyond this country, those many scholars from outside also feel this is such an unprecedented human being determination, strengths, and the sense of solidarity, and also great sacrifice. And then, but also this is not only a kind of a nostalgia, but if we check with the common Chinese people, even those construction workers nowadays are working in African continent, we also understand how they emphasize the coming to each bitterness, and then this kind of a identity, self-identity, really grow out of this part of a history. So we feel this being equal and then jointly consultant way to carry on the project is still core values for the two sides. So then I come to my conclusion part. I feel this is still very important for global development, the meaning, because Tazara has shows that how people can reach during the difficult time, can reach a height with all those very special spirit. And then they didn't have a model to follow, but they just have how to explore. Is really as what we today have emphasized so many times, to really being innovative, to explore. And then the most important things, as what Adam Smith suggested, is still those important mutual communication of knowledge, and then all sorts of important improvement that can be left from whatever the project is. And for the Global South, South-South Cooperation currently, I also feel we can refer to other scholars, what they have previously emphasized, that if older Bandung emphasize political solidarity, currently China is using new way of is trying to establish this new Bandung spirit to use global market as a kind of instrument, trying to reach the common prosperity. And then for that, I think just as what Adam Smith said, finally, there might be a stage that the world can be rather just, the injustice can be dispelled, and then this kind of spirit can still inform China-African cooperation a lot, and then especially during current COVID-19, and then also the Ukraine conflict, all those challenges across the world push all our human beings in the most challenging time, and then we need to continuously explore a new way forward. Thank you. I ended here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. It's fantastic to get this historical perspective and to show us how central rail has been to China-Africa relations for so long. We got two questions, and I'll ask each one to Dr. Lim and one to Dr. Otele. I'll ask you to just respond quite briefly. For Dr. Lim, just a question, what have been the experiences of PPP, so public-private partnership type investments in infrastructure provision, Chinese infrastructure provision in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the Global South? And then to Dr. Otele, what in your opinion was the single most significant element in the decision to go ahead with the standard gauge railway? Was it related to cost benefit considerations, interest, political and other interest groups, or symbolism? So maybe we can go with a brief answer from Dr. Lim first. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. If I understood correctly, it is about the performance of PPP infra projects in Southeast Asia, correct?
Yes.
Yes. All right. I'm not a specialist in this field, but based on well, I've lived quite a long time, so I've traveled across Southeast Asia multiple times. So what I can understand is that it tends to be better if the regulation is better. So you almost never hear of these issues in Singapore, right? I think if you've been to Singapore, you understand what I'm saying here. So it's never been a huge issue in Singapore, right? And the problem, I wouldn't say it's a problem, right? Because a lot of it is self-inflicted. A lot of it is really self-inflicted, right? And if you go further up, right? You go further up mainland Southeast Asia, or if you're in the mood for boat traveling, you go across maritime Southeast Asia, you realize very quickly that it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. Sometimes the private sector, for whatever reason, does pretty bad stuff, and sometimes you realize that the fault lies more with the public sector side. But regardless, what is the common theme, if we can distill, is that if you have more public disclosure of information, things tend to be better, because it's like a disinfectant, right? Because you can't really hide things if you keep telling people things, right? You can, but it's a lot harder. And it tends to be better with things like that. And there is a lot of experimentation. You could in the past, I wouldn't name the countries, but certain countries in Southeast Asia, if you did tenders, it'll be quite, shrouded in secrecy. But that country since then, it's all on the internet and it's open tender, so on and so forth. And people tend to ignore the variation that exists within individual countries, right? So for a state in country X, it some of them can have a more stringent disclosure standard, some of them less, but it tends to be more transparency. That helps a lot. So I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's great. Dr. Otele, just about the question about this, the greatest, in your opinion, the greatest factor in the approval of the standard gauge railway project.
Thank you, Cobus. Interesting question. Allow me to proceed this way. You know, in social sciences, sometimes it's difficult to attribute a single factor to occurrence. You realize that you know there are so many factors at play, but as we say, obviously some are more important than the others, and this is where perhaps the question is directing me to give my view. But also, as I say, other factors are more important than the other, but also the issue of time, space, spatial domain, again, keeps on fluctuating, because at one point, one factor is important, next time, other factor is less important. So allow me to just give a few factors, if you don't mind. And this is the way I want to respond to your question. There were reports that did cost-benefit analysis of SGR. Obviously, the most authoritative report came from the World Bank, which advised the government against the whole idea. It will be counterproductive to implement another line just next to the old British Railway, just to cite the World Bank report. But obviously, the government defied that and went straight to implement. And that is the question, why? Now, back to history, to 2012, 2013, at the time when all these reports were being put before then the government. But again, what was happening in Kenya at the height of transitional election, this project had took a geopolitical dimension, and the key player, of course, now the President Uhuru Kenyatta, who was actually the key driver of the project. You remember he was facing some charges, and the project was seen to be a bulwark against Western forces that were, like, if you end up elected, you are accused, you are not going to do business in Kenya. And so the project being pushed, it was seen as, okay, you don't want to support us, but look, we have other partners who can give us some funds. So who are these partners? Let's go to China, get some funds, and we can counter the Western ideas that they're not willing to support us. So that, in my view, worked to sort of play that ICC card. But now back, another factor that then came in strongly, President Uhuru now taking the leading role to champion for the implementation. We have never seen a project driven by Office of the President like SGR. The President literally visiting site by site to oversee the implementation. What Wang and Wissenberg, I think you, if I got the name right, talk about political championship. So national politics again intermarrying with the geopolitics. See to it that the project, the first phase of the project, got completed just 2 months to election. So two variables, the international variable. At some point, it was more important. Again, it got interaction with the local dynamics to see to it that implementation took effect. So it's a cocktail of factors that were at play. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So with this, we wrap up our rail session, and we are moving straight. So in the first place, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and thank you for all of your accounts of the sector, which really kind of like showed us the full historical sweep of rail cooperation between Africa and China. So it's fantastic to hear. Our next session is on maybe currently the most controversial form of infrastructure cooperation between China and Africa. This is internet network building. You know, the sector's come under a lot of pressure, particularly from during the Trump administration, where there was a lot of pressure on African and other global South governments to not work with China in this particular field. And we saw also significant resistance from within Africa against that pressure. So it's emerged as a very interesting field. It's also a field where we tend to look a lot at issues like surveillance and kind of data security, but not really on ESG implementation of the networks themselves. So we're delighted to be able to fill that gap today. We're speaking with Dr. Motolani Peltola, who worked on the ICT section of this report for us and published under her previous surname, Motolani Akberi. So we're great. We congratulations on your wedding, and we're delighted to feature you. And also again, Dr. Gong Shui, who we're really grateful for bearing with us despite lateness in China. And then also Desiree Nuvot, who is the Southern African Senior Marketing Manager for ICT Policy and Regulation for Huawei. So we're delighted to have someone from within the industry and from Huawei to speak with us today. So Dr. Peltola, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kobus. Firstly, I would like to extend my gratitude to SIA and the Chinese Embassy for putting together this very important workshop and for the invitation to be a part of it. Apologies if I sound a little bit raspy and nasal, but I've been suffering from the flu. It happens to be COVID actually, because I tested positive yesterday. But moving forward, so today's presentation will focus on the ESG impact of Chinese powered ICT infrastructure in Africa by looking at the case of the NICTIV, which is the National ICT Broadband Backbone, a telecommunications project in Tanzania. So a great starting point will be to sort of briefly talk about Chinese involvement in Africa's telecom sector. And this dates back to the late 1990s, where a number of African countries were liberalizing their telecom sectors and were essentially open to private sector involvement. Global telecoms giants such as Huawei, ZTE, Ericsson, Siemens, Nokia played an important role in infrastructure development in this sector. Although particularly significant is the role played by Chinese financing and companies in providing telecoms infrastructure in Africa. So Chinese telecoms equipment manufacturers such as Huawei, through competitive pricing, low production costs, cost-effective equipment and solutions, and access to Chinese state-subsidized funding and support, will later come to dominate the sector, wrestling market share from a lot of the major Western firms such as Ericsson and Siemens. So China's going out policy is also quite pivotal in propelling these companies into the African markets, and their continued presence was essentially sustained by a body made up of the African governments themselves, the Chinese government actors, including policy banks such as the Exim Bank, China Development Bank, China Africa Development Fund, MOFCOM, all providing financial and diplomatic support, and the Chinese companies themselves that were supplying the equipment and expertise in this infrastructural project. Today, Chinese firms are largely visible in Africa's telecommunications stack, from the submarine cables to the data centers, to working with telecoms operators and ISPs, to even to consumer products such as handsets and to network provision, right up to apps and media platforms. Africa's information society is essentially benefiting greatly from this infrastructural development aided by China. So also our Chinese firms, as they've also equally gained access to the continent's infrastructure and consumer markets. Their access to these markets has also enhanced their internationalization and competitiveness abroad. Also, China's involvement in Africa also furthers Beijing's the realization of Beijing's digital Silk Road. So this dominance of Chinese firms in Africa's telecommunications stack places African countries in China's technological sphere of influence. So with this scrutiny, like Cobus mentioned, comes great, or with this dominance rather, like Cobus mentioned, comes great scrutiny. And much of the research has, however, focused on geopolitical implications. While these issues are like important, it is also crucial to understand the environmental, the socio-economic and governance impact of this infrastructure project. And in this research project, I examined the case of the national ICT broadband backbone in Tanzania. So in 2009, Tanzania embarked on a project to deploy a national ICT broadband backbone that would provide higher capacity of ICT services and connectivity to landlocked neighboring countries in East Africa. So phase one, the project is a 5-phase project. Phase 1, 2, and 3 of the project was financed by China's Exim Bank and was implemented by CICCC, so Chinese International Telecommunications Construction Corporation. That's a Chinese telecom firm in collaboration with Huawei. So in terms of the importance of the project, the NICTIB itself was expected to enable the provision of affordable internet to Tanzanians, increase the use of ICT technologies or ICT within Tanzania itself, provide connectivity to all landlocked neighboring countries, establish point of presence across Tanzania's administrative districts, facilitate the implementation of e-government initiatives, and also provide all licensed operators, telecom operators, equal access to fiber networks to catalyze competition in the local market. So though proposals were made to several donor agencies, including the World Bank, but China was the only willing financier of the project at the time, and will go on to finance the first three phases of the project. So the deployment of the NICTIB was, like I said, quite significant, as prior to the NICTIB and the introduction of undersea cables, EV and CCOM, East Africa was the last major region on Earth without fiber optic broadband internet access. So it heavily relied on satellites for access, which was really expensive and posed technical constraints, including limited available bandwidth for domestic and international linkages, transmission delays, and limited quality. So in that sense, the NICTIB essentially improved access, connectivity to broadband in urban and rural areas in Tanzania. It also facilitated the provision and adoption of ICT services in Tanzania, with improvements in delivery of e-services, benefits, and these benefits cut across various sectors of the economy, including education, banking, tourism, health, and agriculture. So there was increased connectivity and utilization of mobile services to send messages, internet access, the use of HEM services such as e-money, mobile banking to transfer money, make payments for services, conduct trade and trade transactions. And also all of this helps to cut down the cost of travel to carry out such payments. So in that sense, it's really fostered ICT, the use of ICT within Tanzania. Also, this has also affected education because there's been increased usage of e-education services connecting, and 28 higher learning and research institutions have been connected with last mile connectivity within Tanzania. And this has also helped in terms of adoption of online applications and admission processes in universities. Furthermore, it's facilitated wide adoption of e-government in Tanzania, as most Tanzanian ministries, departments and agencies and local government authorities are now connected to the NICTIB. So now one must bear in mind that these improvements are actually coming from an extremely low base, and by international standards, Tanzania is still some way to actually becoming a regional ICT hub, despite supplying neighboring countries like Uganda with internet bandwidth. So much work still has to be done in terms of increasing internet usage, as Tanzania still ranks quite low compared to neighboring countries like Kenya. So in terms of job creation also, because this is one aspect that was looked at within the research, in terms of job creation, research shows that there was significant job creation within that project, within the NICTIB project. So CICCC, which was the implementing company, created over 9,000 local jobs and has at the time up to 60% workforce localization rate. Although the workforce localization rate across the project was significant, the skills and technology transfer effect was also rather limited because local suppliers within the project were mainly able to participate in labor-intensive civil and electrical work, activities at the lower end of the value chain in terms of the use of technology, while production of assets at the higher end of the value chain was mostly limited to Chinese suppliers. Also, there was sort of a low proportion of Tanzanians actually occupying managerial and advanced technical positions within CICCC itself. So this also kind of limits the skills and technology transfer effect within the project. Furthermore, while training courses, there were formal training courses that were arranged for locals working on the project, including some actually being sent to China for training. So overseas training organized by CICCC, training was mostly limited to on-the-job training of local employees by shadowing and demonstration, which is rather a common form of training on Chinese projects in Africa. So generally within the project, there was very limited focus on capacity building for local stakeholders who will, at the end of the day, take over the operations and management of the infrastructure. And this has actually been linked to the issue of poor management of the NICTIB by the Tanzanian Telecommunications Company Limited. And this issue has been raised over time by telecom operators in Tanzania. So this leads me to the final point that I look at in terms of the ESG impact of the project. So despite the significant investment in the NICTIB, an issue that's been noted in various studies is also the underutilization of the infrastructure. Reasons such as high tariff rates, connectivity prices, lack of local content, poor after-sales support and management, lack of public awareness of the NICTIB were also identified as reasons for the underutilization of the infrastructure. So essentially, while there were no issues regarding debt sustainability on this project, this issue of underutilization of the infrastructure poses a risk to actually properly leveraging the infrastructure, as well as raises concerns as to the ability of the government to actually recoup its initial investments in the NICTIB. So to conclude, ICT infrastructure like the NICTIB is significant if Africa is to close the digital divide and to also benefit from the global digital economy. However, in terms of the implementation of this project, more can be done by both Chinese and African actors to create conditions to properly leverage this investment for the host country's advantage. I have noted down some policy recommendations that perhaps are much more prominent when we look at this particular case of the NICTIB, and it's mostly centered around human resource development. I think human resource development should be prioritized in the provision of ICT infrastructure. So skills and knowledge transfer, meaningful capacity building is such an important aspect that can actually ensure that this infrastructure can be operated, managed, and sustained by African host countries. This also ensures that investments in this project can actually be sufficiently recouped by the host country. So the benefits of the infrastructure also has to be fully realized. And in order for that to happen, then there has to be meaningful capacity building attached to the project. Also, Africa doesn't want to just remain as, or African countries do not want to remain as producers or as consumers of technology, but also take meaningful role in actually producing through technological upgrading. So African governments also need to press for meaningful technology transfer within projects like this. Policies also that can maximize benefits from this investment, such as local content policies, which would ensure that Chinese firms and contractors have detailed plans for job creation, recruitment of local engineers, human capital development corporation contributions, and value creation for the whole ecosystem within this country. So various studies show that multinational enterprises actually respond to the institutional and regulatory environment within these host countries. As such, the host country has to have play a unique role, or has a unique role to play rather, in influencing and maximizing the employment creation benefits or the skills and technology transfer effects of this infrastructure project. So there is the potential actually for skills and technology transfer within projects such as this is also contingent on the skills composition in the host country and the quality of the human resources in the host country. So attention has to be paid also to this in terms of education and development of strong institutional framework for human capital development, as well as strong local regulatory environment to ensure that policies are being implemented and adhered to. One thing that I would also mention that I think is also very prominent in the other case that would be coming up from Southeast Asia is transparency within this project themselves, particularly in terms of the financing and contracting terms. This should be improved. And there's been so many discussions around this, but I believe that the next presenter will probably touch upon that when we look at the case of Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope we really hope you feel better soon. Thanks so much for pushing through and sharing this with us today. We're moving rapidly to Dr. Gong Xue, and we're very grateful for her kind of hanging on, in Singapore this late. Please go ahead, Dr. Gong.
All right, thank you, Chair. First, I will introduce the features of Chinese ICT investments in Southeast Asia, followed by a brief introduction of a particular case study on the submarine fiber optic cable in Cambodia to see how the ESG was implemented. Then I will conclude with some findings. Different from Africa, that China generally, uses government concessional loans, the preferential buyer's credit in those ICT investments. In Southeast Asia, Chinese market entry in the region is largely through joint venture or capital or equity investment in the telecom companies of Southeast Asia. So that is the first feature. And second is, unlike other sectors of infrastructure dominated by SOEs, Chinese telecom-related activities in Southeast Asia are driven by a mix of private and state-linked companies. And among all these Chinese telecom companies, Huawei remains the most active, and also at the global level in building ecosystems for the digital economy in Southeast Asia, especially in assisting Southeast Asian cities in achieving those smart cities aspirations. And the third feature is that China has been making efforts to set up multilateral mechanisms. For instance, China and ASEAN standard docking, as well as China ASEAN Information Center. And those multilateral formats are very receptive in the region because they are in line with ASEAN's interest in building digital connectivity region. And in particular, and Southeast Asia is a very disaster-prone region. Chinese technology in this regard can help with the disaster management preparedness. And it is very vividly shown in the global health crisis in many of the Southeast Asian countries that they use the China ICT related technology to trace or to detect the cases in the region. And in terms of the specific case that I mentioned about this submarine fiber optic cable projects here in the region, China has completed more than a dozen projects, and nearly 20 more are being constructed or implemented. With regards to the environmental social impacts of China's telecom infrastructure, to be honest, there are scant studies in this region. One reason is that the sector involves much less controversial hotspots like land acquisition, resource exploitation, and therefore it is more acceptable for the civil society compared to resource and land related projects. And second, it has a relatively mature and well-established international standards where Chinese companies like Huawei, they are part of a few international bodies in safeguarding or in engineering, implementing those projects. Based on the study that I did for the report for SIA, the Chinese company that I chose for the case study, High Road, has made great efforts in locating itself or localizing itself in the host country, which is Cambodia. This Chinese company has adopted some common practices for the fiber optic cable laying in terms of adopting the environmental and social impact of the project. It also took the initiative to conduct different forms of corporate social responsibility, capacity building, training the local employees, etc., etc. However, my investigation found that the Chinese company, although they're famous for observing the local laws and regulations, but they do not really move further to promote a much more advanced practice, which they actually have done in the MDB supposed project. For instance, the same Chinese company High Road, which was awarded the AIIB funding and adopted the standards following the AIIB's environmental social policy as well as the environmental social standards in the same country, Cambodia. And additionally, this Chinese company has adopted this environmental and social management plan that details mitigation measures for minimizing negative environmental and social impact. And more importantly, this Chinese company actually followed the AIIB's regulation in terms of adopting the project effective people's mechanisms, PPM, which respects and protects the indigenous groups and minorities in in this funded project. So you see there are two contrasting pictures by the same Chinese company in the same country. So you wouldn't help but ask why there's a discrepancy in those behaviors, right? In my report for the SIRE, clearly transparency issue remains despite the publications of those public reporting. But there's no further information on the details, such as how the financing is provided, and whether it is in loan or whether it is public fundraising or third-party investment. And it's also unclear in the case how the economic returns will be divided and how the company decided on procurement, because all the reporting by this Chinese company did not disclose such information, unlike what has been doing in the AIIB's funded project. But the Chinese company is not the one to blame, because in Southeast Asia, it's difficult to apply advanced practice if the local government standards is really low, and especially when the funding or the founder is not stringent in terms of adopting those high standard practices. As you may know, most of Southeast Asian states, they've been considered as highly corrupted with incredibly low governance capacities in terms of regulatory quality, rules of law, etc. So foreign investors, including the Chinese ones, they're highly vulnerable to the weak institutions. But again, interestingly, the AIIB sponsored same project in Cambodia to the same Chinese company showed that the Chinese companies, investors, they can be competent and competitive as to apply a much advanced standard in infrastructure projects. So once again, I think in terms of the ESG standard, the business actors, they can be very flexible, very adaptive to the legal and normative institutions, regardless of their nationalities. So I shall stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That comparative perspective on the two different projects in Cambodia is so interesting, very revealing. We're moving on to Desiree Nouveau to speak to us from Huawei itself. We're looking forward to this intervention. Thanks, Desiree. Go ahead.
Hi, hello everyone. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, I'm quickly going to greet you, and then I'm going to switch off my video just to conserve some bandwidth, if you don't mind. I am joining you today from Lusaka in Zambia, where we're attending a very important conference that enables the digital economy in our world that we are all trying to build and work towards. So if you don't mind, I'll switch off my video and I shall begin. Firstly, I must start by thanking you, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and to the Chinese Embassy for affording me this opportunity to speak at this forum today. As mentioned by the chairperson, I'm Desiree Nouveau, and I spend my work days in Huawei Technologies Public Affairs and Communications Department, overseeing the ICT policy and regulations for Southern Africa region. Founded in 1987, Huawei is a leading global provider of information and communications technology infrastructure and smart devices. With approximately 190,000 employees, the bulk of which are in research and development, we operate across more than 170 countries and regions, serving more than 3 billion people in our world. It is my greatest pleasure and my deepest honor to talk to you about ICT and its vital role in creating a foundation for digital countries across the African continent. Now, when we talk about future-proofing Africa, there are a few critical elements that must be included in those strategies that take form to move our continent forward. Firstly, Africa is no doubt resource development, with its natural resources that ranges from our arable land to water, oil, natural gas, minerals, forests, and wildlife. Harnessing these to grow the economy of African countries can only be aided and supported with the use of modern-day technologies. This would then better position the continent to simultaneously address persisting problems of inequality and inequitable access to services, while creating opportunities for intensified and deepened economic growth across all sectors. The uneven distribution of and access to quality public and commercial services for rural versus urban population groups, or rich versus poor, educated versus the not so educated, remains alarming. This divide was, of course, brought sharply into focus in the last 2-3 years with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next is, of course, the topic of resilience, which took on added importance and urgency in the post-pandemic era. How can governments and businesses build in resilience into systems to enable continuity of service delivery should any other life-altering external threat emerge like we experienced with the pandemic? Threats or the realities of war, droughts, flooding, intense storms, phenomena related really to climate change, water shortages, food shortages, and environmental pollution all have the potential to disrupt our daily lives. Guarding against these disruptions using whatever means necessary can therefore no longer be delayed until adequate funding is secured, resources are allocated, or time presents. Now more than ever, Africa has to consider policies and strategies to attract and increase investment, boost productivity, and drive development for meaningful and tangible results to be seen at ground level in the way people live, work, and play. Closely linked to this discussion is the topic of skills development, of course, of a growing youth population that we expect to fuel the workforce needs of Africa in the fourth industrial revolution. According to a report by the IFC and Google, Africa's internet economy is one of the largest overlooked investment opportunities available currently, with the potential to add 180 billion USD to Africa's GDP by 2025. So there's undoubtedly massive potential for digital growth opportunities across Africa. This, however, is critically dependent on ensuring that digital infrastructure is pervasive and the access thereof is seamless and affordable. So when we talk about reliance on quality digital infrastructure foundations, we have to consider that infrastructure affects economic growth through a number of supply and demand side channels, according to the World Bank. Investments in energy, transport, water, and telecommunications networks directly impact growth, with their availability enabling the production of goods and services, while their unavailability or intermittent stoppages for whatever reason severely impacts productivity. Infrastructure connects households across metropolitan areas to higher quality services like healthcare and education, as well as opportunities for skills development and employment. ICT, however, also has a significant cross-cutting impact across different economic sectors and verticals, with its ability to use technologies to deliver better quality and more responsive services on demand. Africa, though, still lags behind other regions in the world with the scale and impact of infrastructure rollout to all parts of countries currently. In terms of investment trends, we know that in sub-Saharan Africa's internet access has grown in leaps and bounds at one of the fastest paces in the world, given the strong incentive for investment within the continent. And also we know that there's a massive, large growing youth population, as well as rapid urbanization, which serves as strong drivers for the demand for digitalization. Digital transformation can only be fully realized if access to high quality telecommunications networks and services is made available readily and, of course, affordably. The last few years have seen increased investment in data centers, of course, across the continent, as well as in more subsea cables reaching more of our countries. Governments and enterprises of all sizes have seen the benefit of moving their operations to the cloud to ensure business and service continuity, regardless of the environmental threats being faced. Accelerating the type and the pace of investments into digital infrastructure in Africa will be critical to ensure the development and growth goals are achieved, so society benefits from the improved quality of lives and, of course, the improved opportunities. In terms of mobile networks, connectivity has played a vital role in boosting Africa's internet connection. Africa's network coverage by population, if we consider the statistics reported by the GSMA Intelligence Organization, at the end of the second quarter for 2022, 3G was reported to have reached 90%, while 4G coverage by population had reached 74%. 5G networks have started to be deployed, and they've been established already in 6 African markets, including South Africa and Togo, and the island nations of Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, and Reunion. With a population of 1.4 billion people, Africa has over 706 million unique mobile subscribers, of which 448 million are unique mobile internet subscribers. The continent has in excess of 1.2 billion connections, and mobile market penetration by connections that reaches around 87%. Yet smartphone penetration by connections remains at 48%. Mobile connectivity is likely to remain the dominant means of internet access for Africans, with high-speed 4G and 5G networks providing far greater bandwidth, lower latency, and a myriad of new digital products and services that will meet the growing needs of the continent. However, questions arise around how many people are still too far away from next-generation network sites that have been deployed, and how many live within areas of high-quality broadband coverage that actually are capable of accessing and utilizing those services. Then when we talk about fiber to the homes, fiber to the premises, widespread availability of high-speed broadband internet through fiber to the premises connections to homes and offices remains severely underdeveloped even now in 2022, with rollout being mainly restricted to capital cities. Fiber-based broadband services household penetration remains below 2% across sub-Saharan Africa, although South Africa does a lot better with their fiber-based broadband subscriptions, representing almost half of all fiber-based subscriptions in the region. More has to be done to make fiber more pervasive across our countries, beginning with greater access, of course, to subsea cables reaching Africa. The concept of meaningful connectivity is now, I think, a well-entrenched topic in our discussions around digital inclusion. By this, we of course refer to the user's access to smartphones specifically, and 4G mobile internet as a minimum, along with unlimited access points in homes, places of work or study. Across the 52 countries in Africa, we still have significant numbers of people living in rural areas, ranging from 86% in Burundi to around 30% in South Africa. Many of these rural dwellers do not have access to meaningful or even basic connectivity. The Alliance for Affordable Internet found that, for example, in Mozambique and in Rwanda, fewer than 1 in 50 people in rural areas have meaningful connectivity. Addressing the coverage gaps across Africa is faced with several challenges, as we know, chief amongst them being rural network deployment costs. Tower construction costs including civil works, are no doubt higher in rural areas due to the underdeveloped terrain and the lack of existing infrastructure. Energy costs are also significant contributors to the cost of running sites in rural areas, leading to unfavorable returns for investors. There is still the burning need, however, to deliver quality connectivity to all parts of the country and segments of the population, more specifically those marginalized in rural areas. Huawei addresses the rural connectivity challenge with very nuanced infrastructure solutions like the Rural Star. Now, Rural Star is a lightweight rural network coverage solution that supports 2G, 3G, and 4G connectivity. Rather than using satellite or microwave backhaul, Rural Star uses a more affordable, non-line-of-sight wireless backhaul technology with 10 to 40 kilometer reach over cellular relay, linking connectivity from a donor site, which is an existing macro site. This is a useful function in emerging market geographies with, for example, mountainous, desert, or island terrains. For Rural Star site build, small trucks are more than capable of transporting the required equipment, reducing again the deployment costs as well as deployment time in unconnected areas given terrain-related difficulties of reaching more rural areas. Furthermore, Rural Star Pro requires only 2 solar panels to power an entire site, significantly reducing power consumption and lowering the weight of the base station to nearly 550 kilograms. Where alternative power supply is concerned, several solutions are readily available, ranging from grid-tied photovoltaic systems, which save electricity long-term, with no backup being required, to on-grid systems using battery backup and off-grid solutions delivering large PV arrays to serve the household or commercial daily load needs using sufficiently large battery banks supported where necessary by further generator backup. So these solutions talk to the everyday realities of all people, but especially those households in rural and remote areas. These are the types of solutions that are needed to connect the remaining millions who, until today, remain unconnected. Lastly, we must consider the opportunities available to people to join the digital society and become contributors to the shaping thereof. There is a marked lack of digital knowledge and skills required to use the available technologies and services. Facilitating skills development ensures that there are individuals with the capacity to operate the newly developed digital infrastructure more effectively and to consistently adapt to the frequent changes while complying with the ICT laws of the respective countries. Upskilling the current workforce is essential to ensure that our people in Africa are fully equipped to contribute to the growth of the industry and therefore to their country's growing digital economy. And as I conclude, a trend that emerged post-pandemic has been the movement of professionals to smaller towns and cities as remote working policies were introduced and sustained once the worst of the pandemic was brought under control. This means that it is now even more insufficient to have only basic connectivity in rural and remote areas while urban areas are continuously prioritized. The quality of service and the quality of experience needs are a reality across our countries, now more than ever before. Concerted efforts into achieving the digital connectivity goals across our countries is paramount if our people in Africa are to benefit from digitalization and connection to the internet. This begins with the relevant policies and strategies enabling the rapid deployment of digital infrastructure across our cities and towns to accelerate the transformation of our society and our economies. Huawei's mission is to bring digital to every person, to every home and organization for a fully connected and intelligent world. To this end, we will continue to drive ubiquitous connectivity and promote equal access to networks to lay the foundation for this intelligent world, provide diversified computing power to deliver pervasive cloud and intelligence, and build powerful digital platforms to help all industries and organizations to become more agile, efficient, and dynamic. I thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Thank you. Just as we wrap up the session, I just would like to ask for comments from all three of the speakers. Just around the issue of kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, among infrastructure categories, we find that ICT provision is facing the most, or some of the most, geopolitical pressure. Including a lot of funding from the G7 and so on to provide alternative network building. So I was wondering if all three of you could reflect on how you think these kinds of pressures are shifting the ICT landscape in Africa and in the global South. And what the future looks like for global South Chinese ICT cooperation. Maybe Motolani, maybe you can go first, and then Gongxue, and then Desiree, if that would work.
Cobus, was that on geopolitical implications of ICT infrastructure provision? Was that the question? Sorry, I didn't quite catch it all.
Yes, as geopolitical pressures kind of activate more and more kind of competing funding, do you foresee the landscape becoming more complex, or is there, do you think that the China-Africa internet cooperation will continue as is into the future?
Yeah, well, I do think that the China-Africa cooperation within this particular sector is going to continue. Maybe not as usual. There will be more players for sure. And there's already talks about investment coming from Western companies as well as Western actors, whether they're like governments or institutions that are willing to invest into the ICT sector. And I think for the good of the development of Africa's ICT sector, it's just great that there will be more participation from different angles, not just from China, but also from Western companies as well as Western actors. I don't think there's any African country that would say that, oh, we just want to be fine with just this one provider. A multiplicity of providers would be what is beneficial for the whole ecosystem. And I think that's just the way to go. Obviously, things will become more complicated. And we've already seen calls of certain foreign governments telling African governments not to subscribe to services from certain companies, certain Chinese companies. I don't think African countries can afford to do that. It's best that we remain open to opportunities and investment coming from various providers. And I think that's just the way to go in terms of this. We shouldn't be one-sided in terms of where or who is providing what. Obviously, we should scrutinize this projects and make sure that African governments can actually leverage these investments for what's best, as beneficial as it is, or what would be most beneficial for African society. And I think when we have multiple players, then we can actually do that better.
Thank you. Gong Xue, how does it look from the Southeast Asian perspective?
Yeah, for Southeast Asia, it's a very interesting case because it has already become a strategic competition hotbed for the two great powers, China and United States. But here, if I can borrow, the survey conducted last year by our local institute, ICIS, based in Singapore, they conducted a survey in terms of which, nationality of telecom or telecom-related technology is preferred in the region. The Chinese telecom providers such as Datang Telecom, Huawei, and ZTE, they are actually the second most preferred partners in building 5G infrastructure just right after South Korea, Samsung. In countries like Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, the preference for Chinese telecom companies is even much stronger. And the survey also shows that the Chinese company providers are preferred over their U.S. competitors in almost all ASEAN member states. But of course, these the results of the survey are evolving due to the geopolitical dynamics. But the region now the region itself tries to frame the narratives on the implications of both great powers, high tech export. They have been very careful in terms of choosing sides. So with that being said, all the countries here, they try to strengthen their national autonomy and independence, from these, national security related high tech, but also they embrace a multilateral platform to diversify the risks of, interconnectedness because of globalization and regionalization. So back to the question, I think Southeast Asia at this point, they have been very smart, in trying to, as I said, trying to diversify and mitigate the risks of putting the eggs into one basket.
Thank you. And Desiree, what does it look like from your perspective?
So I think for Huawei as a network equipment vendor, it's important for us to stick to what we've been really good at. I mentioned earlier that a big chunk of our staff are actually in R&D. That's 55% more or less of our staff are involved in research and development, and a huge portion of our profits are pumped back into research and development to ensure that the products we bring are valuable to the countries in which we start to deploy them, because we really are driven by this need to ensure that the last person in the last most remotest of villages are connected. So having always supported an open ecosystem, we do want to see more players in the ecosystem, and we support this actively through our skills development program and other innovative programs that we have in place to ensure that we have a lot more innovations coming from our young African developers. Huawei, of course, will continue this because we really do want to see the ecosystem flourish with a lot more very nuanced solutions arising from the local people in the countries in which we operate, and working together with them in innovation and incubation hubs to bring this to reality and to deliver them and deploy them practically, so that we start to see very meaningful benefits arising from our countries where very unique problems are being addressed on a daily basis. So I think that's all I have to add after what Dr. Peltola has contributed very comprehensively to this question.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all three speakers who joined us across time zones and illness and connectivity problems and everything to bring us these insights. We really appreciate it. It's fantastic to speak with all of you. So we are wrapping up today's session, and we're going to hand over just to Professor Chris Alden to start us off with some closing remarks, and then I'll just finish us off. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Quibus. It's been quite a lively session, and one that's embraced a lot of topics, a lot of themes, and it's hard to pull out the key themes, at least from my corner where I see it. Maybe the way I can do is boil it down to three things. One is the significance of context here. So this is a comparative study across very different regions, across sectors, and experiences. And the context at a macroeconomic level has influenced choices on the part of the government of China, on the part of firms operating within a changing economic and indeed even political context. We just concluded a discussion where geopolitics surfaced, so that geopolitical context is one of the new changes we've seen. So decision-making on questions of ESG at the planning phase are probably most likely to be found emerging out of that larger systemic setting where Agenda 2030, the SDGs and other things have been formulated and signed onto by states and indeed leading businesses as well. So if context is one feature, I think another one is complexity, and that complexity that we've seen is the very same one we've discussed in great detail. It is the detail of the situation in Indonesia or in Kenya or in Cambodia, in Nigeria. This Tanzania, this level of complexity is what we experience when we dig down into the national economies and in parallel the sectors that are there. Policy environments that differ, societies that are at different stages of development experience and responses to these sectors and economies and opportunities. And in that context, I think the implementation of environmental, social, and governance dimensions of the infrastructure projects is most readily exposed to the implementation by Chinese firms, is most readily exposed to all that complexity. So in some cases, state-owned enterprises can find themselves, or private firms or Chinese firms can find themselves at the center of controversy without even meaning to be. They're hostage, if you like, to a host government's own lack of capacity or lack of planning or failure to communicate to local communities about certain dimensions, or poor investment decisions, or all other factors. So that idea of complexity is baked in to any implementation of infrastructure projects, and Chinese firms would do well to recognize that. They certainly do, in some cases, recognize it, but find a way to engage and mitigate that. And then finally, compliance. Our research has shown across all the different projects we've examined that the Chinese firms do respond. They don't always put it at the forefront of their implementation strategies, but they do respond to incentives that make ESG elements a requirement of projects. Who's going to provide these incentives? Do we find those in the policy banks at the planning phase? Is it with the Chinese government? Is it the host government in the negotiation of that initial project, as it were, if they're involved, unless it's more localized government? Is it to be found in actually the reactive or responses of civil society who say, hey, you forgot about us. Where's the land payments, as was the case in Kenya. We've been displaced. So I think that understanding these, if you like, these 3 C's of context, complexity, and compliance helps us to understand what the issues are in upgrading and universalizing this ESG standard that at least formally is part of our discussions and recognized by national governments and on the international stage. Let me leave it at that and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely, yeah. These kind of 3 C's provide such a useful frame, you know, kind of to start grappling with this complexity. And I you know, kind of I don't have much to add. The only thing that I would add is that these issues become more crucial, more complex, more important as we head into a climate crisis. The climate crisis that Africa has very little responsibility for, but where it's being hit disproportionately. And you know, kind of in order for us to grapple with the full implication of ESG, we have to then also grapple with how those ESG issues fit into this bigger project of surviving a climate crisis, while also achieving development. So in that sense, you know, kind of I think China's relationship with Africa is key. Its relationship with the whole global south is key. And our work as researchers is, you know, partly to really kind of unpack how all of that cooperation works and to try and then make suggestions to try and improve it for everyone. So I wanted to thank everyone listening and all of the speakers, and we just kind of want to close off with just a final comment from Lauren Johnson. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi, thanks everyone. I wanted to add a couple of comments that might also help direct future research that extends all of this research. I found the discussion and presentations on the railway line in Indonesia and the competition between China and Japan very, very interesting. And then this sense of that there was an equivalent lack of competition perhaps at the Africa, and there's not these 2 established infrastructure giants with a lot of regional experience and knowledge equivalently. And also that's East Asian firms in East Asia rather than East Asian firms in Africa. And then I was thinking about Tanzania, which at least from a distance, I haven't looked at it closely, seems to be playing off Turkey and China quite well, and perhaps even Europeans in the railway sector. And so I wonder if there's any use in having a look at that, how Tanzania is playing off, because it's also such a usefully located hub in terms of its landlocked connectivity. And they seem to be utilizing that quite. So I just wonder if there's any additional lessons that can be drawn from that over and above what has been learned from the Kenya experience. And then secondly, on the ICT session, also the Tanzania story goes back to the Tandara Railway, of course, so there's that whole kind of big picture. And then in the ICT sense, in 1980s and 1990s, China, I suspect they were saying equivalent things to some of today's speakers in terms of how can we make sure Chinese citizens, Chinese nationals can learn all about this ICT framework. And at the time, it was Nokia and Motorola in China with a presence teaching Chinese how to, and of course, Huawei sort of have since displaced relatively Motorola and Nokia. So I just wonder what Africa's plan is to displace Huawei. And perhaps there is a use, particularly the speaker who's based in Finland, Mosolani, perhaps even her next project can be to dig out all of the Nokia executives who were in China in the 1980s and 1990s and find out what exactly, like how did China learn so much so quickly from these companies and what can Africa learn from that? So I think if there's a way to dig back to Nokia and Motorola and extract some of those lessons so that some African company can displace Huawei in the same way, maybe that could be a goal for 2050 also.
Thank you. There might be a Desiree Lauren fight coming down the way. Thanks so much for these comments. They're fantastic, and they give us this kind of glimpse of how we can draw this work forward. You know, I think there's so much more to explore. I'd like to thank everyone listening, and all of the speakers. We so grateful for your work, for your research, and for presenting today. We're really very glad. Thanks so much, and thanks for everyone for listening.